Cowboy, you can't choose just one. By ancient law, you must marry all sisters. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Caleb Merrick rode into town with the same purpose he always had, to get what he needed and get back before dark. His place sat 8 miles west, a small ranch patched together after the fire that took the first one and the graves that still marked the rise behind it. He was 35 now, lean from work, scarred in places that never healed right after the war. Towns weren't his favorite place. Too many eyes, too much talk. But he needed nails, lamp oil, salt, and a few other things he couldn't raise out on the flats. The square came into view just after noon, shimmering under the heat. It should have been ordinary, a couple of wagons, horses tied along the porch rails, men standing outside the saloon wiping sweat with their hats. But the sound that rolled across the street stopped him. It wasn't the usual Saturday noise. It was sharper, meaner. Near the far edge of the square stood a rough freight wagon with its side gate down. 3 young women were tied to the rail like stock. A wooden sign leaned against the wheel, its paint rough and fresh. Forfeit by law, T.O.B. claimed. Caleb reined the roan in jaw tight. This wasn't the first time he'd seen something like it, but it hit him the same way it always did, low in the gut like a stone dropped there. He swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the packed dirt. He didn't like crowds and didn't know the town anything, but leaving them, there wasn't something he could ride past. He tied the roan to the rail and walked closer, pushing through the half-circle of men gathered to watch. The smell of sweat, whiskey, and horse piss hung in the heat. The sheriff stood near the wagon with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Father lost him in a game," one of the men muttered. "Old law says they get sold off to settle the debt." Caleb didn't answer. His eyes went to the sisters. The oldest stood at the front, chin high despite the rope biting into her wrists. Dust streaked her face. Her dress was torn across the bodice, exposing a strip of skin that made the men nearby stare longer than they needed to. Sweat had dampened the cloth so it clung to her ribs. She met Caleb's gaze head-on, no plea in it, just defiance. The middle sister stayed close to her side, one arm around the youngest girl who looked barely 16, barefoot and shaking. Her eyes kept darting from face to face, flinching every time a man laughed or spat. Caleb saw the way the middle one's jaw was locked, her body angled as if she'd throw herself between the men and the younger girl if she had to. He turned to the sheriff. "Price." The sheriff squinted at him, maybe expecting an argument first, but Caleb only stood there, calm, waiting. $30 for the lot, the sheriff said finally. Caleb dug the coins from his pocket and counted them out on the wagon's sideboard. Each one hit the wood with a flat ring that carried through the square. When the last was down, he stepped to the oldest sister and untied the rope. She flinched when his fingers brushed hers but didn't pull away. The middle sister looked him over once, then let him untie her as well. The youngest nearly fell forward when the rope came free. Caleb caught her under the arm and steadied her until she got her feet under her again. No one spoke as he led them toward the roan. The crowd shifted aside. Caleb lifted the youngest onto the mule tied nearby, then the middle sister. The oldest stayed on the ground, still watching him as though she wasn't sure what kind of man he was yet. "What's your name?" she asked finally, her voice raw from the sun. "Caleb Merrick," he said. She nodded once, like she had weighed the answer and found it enough for now. He swung into the saddle, reached a hand down to her. For a moment she just stood there, chin still high. Then she took it and let him pull her up behind him. They rode out of the square without another word. The noise of the town faded behind them until it was just the creak of leather and the steady clop of hooves. Caleb kept his eyes ahead, thinking about the work waiting back at the ranch and how 3 strangers would fit into it, if they even wanted to. Behind him, he could feel the oldest sister's grip on the back of the saddle. Not too tight, not too loose, her breath close enough that he knew she was scared but steady. The middle sister kept her head down, one hand on her sister's knee, as if to say they were still together. The sun beat down. The road stretched west. Whatever they were now, passengers, strangers, debts paid, they were heading to his place, and that meant they were his responsibility. The road west stayed quiet except for the creak of saddle leather and the slow rhythm of hooves. The sun had begun to tilt lower, casting long shadows over the scrub and rocks. Caleb kept the roan at a steady walk, not rushing, but not giving the town a chance to send anyone after them either. He didn't look back. He never did. But he listened for the sound of hooves that never came. Mara sat straight behind him, her hands holding the back of the saddle horn, every muscle tight, as if ready to jump off and run if she had to. The middle sister sat on the mule, holding the reins loosely, glancing back once toward the shrinking town, then forward again at the horizon. The youngest leaned against her shoulder, exhausted, letting the movement of the mule sway her half asleep. After a while, Mara spoke, her voice low and flat. "Where are you taking us?" "My place," Caleb said, not turning his head. "Why?" she pressed. He thought about that a moment before answering. "Because leaving you, there wasn't something I could do." She didn't say anything after that, but he could feel the way her grip loosened just a little, her back no longer rigid against him. It was near dark when they reached the ranch. The cabin sat low against a rise, the corral gate leaning but still holding, the cottonwood near the creek catching the last light in its sparse leaves. It wasn't much, just a single-room house with a lean-to and a shed, but it was whole and it was his. Caleb swung down, helped the sisters dismount, and led them to the porch. "You can stay in the lean-to tonight," he said, pointing to the side room where he kept feed and spare tools. "It's dry, and I'll clear space." Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and iron from the stove. The floor was swept clean, a table and 2 chairs pulled close to the hearth. A single bed sat against the far wall. Caleb moved to the lean-to and began pulling out sacks of grain and tools, stacking them outside under the eaves until there was enough room for the 3 of them to spread blankets on the floor. The middle sister stepped in first, checking the corners like she didn't quite trust it yet. The youngest followed, still quiet, clutching the blanket Caleb had given her. Mara stayed in the doorway a moment, looking over the small space, then finally stepped inside, setting her jaw as if deciding it would do. Caleb built the fire back up in the stove and set a pot of beans to warm. "Water pumps outside," he said. "You can wash before you eat." Mara looked at him hard for a moment, then nodded once and took the bucket. He watched from the porch as she worked the pump, rinsed the dust from her arms and face, then passed the bucket to her sisters. When they came back inside, he ladled beans into tin plates and set out a heel of bread and coffee. They ate without much talk. The only sound was the scrape of spoons and the fire popping. Caleb sat at the far end of the table, not staring but not ignoring them either. He caught the youngest glancing at him once, then quickly back to her food. When the meal was done, Mara stacked the plates without being told and carried them to the basin. Caleb poured in hot water from the kettle and handed her the dishcloth. Their hands brushed, and she pulled back slightly, then went back to scrubbing. Outside, night had fallen full. The air smelled of dust cooling after the day's heat. Caleb checked the corral one last time, making sure the gate was shut, then came back inside. The sisters were already in the lean-to, the youngest curled against the wall, the middle lying close beside her. Mara sat with her back against the doorframe, knees drawn up, watching the fire as if she wasn't ready to sleep yet. "You safe here," Caleb said quietly from across the room. She looked at him, her face unreadable in the firelight. "For how long?" "As long as you want," he said, his tone even. She seemed to think about that for a while, then nodded once. "Good," she said finally, before lying down beside her sisters. Caleb banked the fire low and stretched out on his bed. The cabin fell into silence except for the crackle of the last coals. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the first night in a long time any of them had slept behind a latched door. Morning came cold enough that Caleb could see his breath when he stepped outside to rake the coals back into flame. The grass around the corral was still wet with dew, boots leaving dark prints as he walked the fence line. No trouble in the night, no tracks near the gate, and that eased something in him. By the time he came back in, the sisters were already stirring. Mara was up first, hair pulled back into a loose braid, looking at him as if waiting for instruction. The middle sister sat on her knees beside the youngest, who blinked against the light, rubbing sleep from her face. "There's a pump outside," Caleb said, keeping his voice steady. "Fill the barrel halfway. 2 trips should do it." Mara nodded once, not arguing, and led her sisters out with the bucket. He heard the creak of the pump handle, the splash of water into the barrel, then the sound of boots on the porch again. When they came in, cheeks pink from the cold, he had coffee boiling and biscuits set out with the last of the bean from the night before. They ate quiet, but not as tense as the night before. The youngest risked a small question. "You live here alone?" "Yes," Caleb said. "Why?" she asked, wide-eyed, before the middle sister nudged her hard under the table. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't take offense. "Had a wife," he said simply. "She's buried on the rise behind the barn." He didn't say more, but the air shifted as if that explained enough. Mara lowered her eyes for the first time, not from fear, but from respect. After breakfast, he set them to work. "Floor needs sweeping," he said, pointing to the broom. "Chickens need feeding. Coop's behind the shed." The middle sister took to the work without complaint, carrying feed and scattering it across the yard, keeping her distance from the birds but standing her ground when they rushed her. The youngest followed her, giggling when a hen pecked at her boot. Caleb watched from the porch, arms crossed, saying nothing but noting the way they moved. They weren't useless, not like some might have thought back in town. Inside, Mara swept the floor, the broom rasping over the planks. She moved with tight precision, like she wanted to prove she knew how to work. When she caught him watching her, she stopped, one hand on the broom handle. "You gonna stand there all day?" she asked, not sharp but testing him. He grunted once. "Just making sure you're not putting the dirt under the bed." She smirked slightly and went back to sweeping. It was the first crack in her guarded face he'd seen. Later, Caleb took them outside to mend a section of the fence that had fallen in the last storm. "Hold this post straight," he told Mara, showing her where to brace it while he hammered the spike. She planted her boots and gripped the wood, muscles in her forearms standing out. He swung the hammer hard, the sound ringing through the empty air. When he checked the rail and found it square, he said, "Good hold." It was just 2 words, but Mara's mouth twitched as if she was fighting the urge to smile. She moved to the next post without waiting to be told, and Caleb realized he hadn't had anyone working beside him like this in years. By mid-afternoon, the sisters had found a rhythm, sweeping, mending, hauling water, and the cabin no longer looked like a place a man lived alone. Caleb felt it too. In a way, the air inside seemed less heavy, the sound of the youngest humming under her breath as she helped dry the dishes. When evening came, he cooked pork fat and beans in the skillet, setting the plates on the table without ceremony. They ate together again, this time with fewer glances at the door. Mara stayed behind after the others had gone to the lean-to, wiping the table clean. "You paid for all 3 of us," she said finally, not looking at him. "You could have taken just one." Caleb set his cup down slow. "It wasn't about taking," he said. "It was about getting you out." She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw her shoulders drop just slightly, like a weight she'd been carrying might finally be letting go. When the fire was banked for the night and the house went quiet, Caleb lay awake for a while, listening to the faint sound of the sisters breathing in the lean-to. The cabin no longer felt like an empty place that just kept the rain off. It felt like something starting to fill. It wasn't trust yet, not fully, but it was the first step toward it. The next morning came with a pale sky and the sound of a hawk calling from somewhere beyond the ridge. Caleb was already outside, checking the mule's hooves when the sisters stepped onto the porch. Mara had tied her hair back tighter today. The middle sister carried the bucket without being told, and the youngest followed barefoot, her dress washed and hung to dry overnight so that it no longer smelled of the wagon. Caleb nodded toward the pump. "Fill the trough first," he said, "then the barrel." There was no sharpness in his tone, just steady expectation. He didn't have to tell them twice. While they worked, Caleb hauled a plank and a box of nails from the shed. A rail had split on the south side of the corral, and he wanted it set before noon. Mara followed him, wiping her hands on her skirt. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "Hold this straight," he said, showing her where to brace the post. His hand closed over hers for just a second as he positioned it. The roughness of his palm catching her skin before he stepped back to swing the hammer. Each strike rang out clear in the cold air, sending small vibrations through the post into her grip. She didn't flinch. When it was done, he checked the rail, gave a single approving nod, and said, "Good work." The words were plain, but they sat heavy with meaning. Mara felt something twist in her chest, a mix of pride and a strange relief that she hadn't expected to feel from him. By late morning, the sun had warmed enough for the youngest to sit on the porch steps and hum while the middle sister sorted the tin cups and mended a rip in one of the blankets. Caleb watched them through the open door as he cleaned his rifle at the table. It was the first time he'd left the door wide since they'd arrived, as if daring anyone to ride in and try to undo what he had set right. Mara came in, brushing dust from her skirt, and stood at the table. "You keep this place alone all the time?" she asked, not accusing, just curious. Most times, Caleb said, sliding the rag down the barrel of the rifle. "Why?" He didn't look up. "Because a man gets used to quiet after he's lost enough." Mara didn't press further, but her eyes softened slightly. She turned toward the stove and began stirring the pot he'd left warming, tasting it with the wooden spoon. "Needs salt," she said, setting it back without asking permission. Caleb glanced at her, then reached for the tin and slid it across the table. She salted it herself and gave a small nod. When a meal was ready, they sat together at the table, this time with the door still open and the light spilling across the floor. Conversation was still sparse, but the silence was different now. Not as heavy, almost companionable. The youngest spoke once about a hawk she'd seen circling the creek bed, and Caleb said, "Keeps the rats down," which made her grin. After supper, Mara stayed behind again, washing the plates while the other two sisters went to the lean-to. Caleb dried them silently, setting each one on the shelf. At one point, Mara's sleeve slipped down her arm, the loose twine around her bodice coming undone slightly from a day's work. Caleb noticed and looked away at once, jaw tight, but he didn't leave the room. "You don't say much," Mara said quietly. "Don't have much to say," he replied. She turned toward him then, leaning back against the table. "Then why bring us here?" Caleb set the last plate down and faced her fully. "Because no one else was going to do it, and because you didn't deserve what was about to happen." Mara held his gaze a long moment, searching for any sign of a lie, and found none. Something in her shoulders loosened. She stepped closer, close enough that the warmth from the stove brushed her side. "Then we'll earn our place here," she said. "You already are," Caleb said simply, and the words landed heavier than she expected. The fire had burned low by the time Mara finally went to the lean-to. Caleb banked the coals and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before lying down. The cabin was quiet except for the faint sound of the sisters breathing and the night wind tapping against the shutters. For the first time since he buried his wife, Caleb felt the house wasn't just holding him together, it was holding something alive. 3 days later, Caleb decided it was time to face the town again. He didn't like going back so soon, but the paper nailed to the wagon that day still sat folded on the table, its words burning in the back of his mind. If he didn't put it to rest proper, someone would come looking. He hitched the mule to the wagon just after dawn, the air cold enough that their breath hung in clouds. The sisters came out without being called. Mara had washed and mended her dress, stitching the torn bodice so it held better, though the fabric still sat low at her collarbone. The middle sister wore an old shirt Caleb had found in a trunk, cinched with a rope belt that made her look more like she belonged here than she had before. The youngest wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and climbed onto the wagon bench without hesitation. Caleb didn't talk much on the ride. His jaw stayed tight, the reins steady in his hands, his mind on the clerk's office and the judge. Mara watched him out of the corner of her eye, reading the way he held himself, like a man who had already made a decision and wouldn't be turned from it. By the time they reached town, the square was busy. Wagons parked at angles, men standing outside the saloon, hats pushed back, curious eyes tracking them as they rolled past. Caleb didn't look at them, guiding the mule straight to the clerk's office. The bell above the door gave a thin ring as they stepped inside. The clerk, a man with gray in his beard and a bored expression, looked up from a ledger. Didn't figure to see you again so soon, he said. Caleb set the folded notice on the counter. Need this voided, he said. The clerk frowned, picking it up and reading the rough paint marks. Law says. Law says nothing about selling people. Caleb cut in, voice low but steady. I paid what was asked to stop something worse. That's done now. The clerk hesitated, then disappeared into the judge's chamber. A moment later, the judge himself came out, a tall, thin man with deep lines around his mouth. He read the paper slowly, then looked at the sisters standing behind Caleb. The youngest shifted closer to Mara, clutching her sleeve. These girls are free, the judge said finally, signing the paper with a quick stroke. And if there's a man in this county who says otherwise, he can answer for it in my court. He took out a second page and wrote Caleb's name, noting that the two younger sisters were under his protection until they chose otherwise or came of age. Then he turned to Mara. You're grown. You can go where you want. Mara looked at the judge, then at Caleb. His face stayed impassive, offering neither command nor comfort. I'm not leaving, she said quietly. The judge's pen hovered. Then he nodded and signed the last line. Then it settled. When they stepped back outside, the air felt different, like the weight of the town had shifted just slightly. The same men still stood near the saloon, still watching, but there was no jeering now, only muttering. One man spat and said under his breath, Ancient law says you can't just take all three. Caleb stopped and turned his head just enough to meet the man's eyes. No law says I can't, he said calmly. And no man here owns them. The man shifted but didn't come closer. The sheriff had appeared on the porch by then, his hand near his belt, watching the exchange without a word. After a long silence, the man stepped back, letting the words die in the dust. Caleb led the sisters back to the wagon. Mara climbed up without needing a hand this time, her chin high as she faced the square. The middle sister's shoulders seemed straighter too, and the youngest looked less afraid than she had when they first left this place. The ride home was quiet but not tense. Mara looked ahead, her fingers resting lightly on the bench instead of gripping hard. She asked no questions, and Caleb gave no explanation. What needed to be said had been put to paper, and that was enough. When they reached the cabin, Caleb unhitched the mule and set it to water. Mara stayed on the porch a moment, looking toward the rise where Caleb had said his wife was buried. Then she turned back toward the cabin. We belong here now, she said softly, almost to herself. Caleb heard her and nodded once. It was not a promise, not yet, but it was the first time she had spoken about the place as if it might hold them. Inside, the fire was still banked from the morning, and the air felt warmer than it had when they left. Not from the stove, but from what they had brought back with them, a piece of paper that meant no one could take them away. The days that followed felt different, as if the air around the cabin had shifted. The paper from the judge sat folded in a tin under the floorboards, and though no one mentioned it aloud, its presence carried weight. The sisters moved through the house with more certainty now. The middle one took to sweeping the porch every morning without being asked, and the youngest began to hum when she worked, soft at first, then louder, until it filled the cabin like something alive. Caleb rose before daylight, as always, raking coals in a flame and stepping outside to check the yard. By the time he came back in, Mara had already lit the lamp and set out the tin cups. Their eyes met across the table. No words passed, but something in her expression said she had decided this was her place too. That morning he set corner posts for a new pen by the corral. Hold it level, he told Mara, handing her the brace. She planted her boots in the dirt and gripped the wood steady. Sweat streaked her temple by the time he drove the last spike, but she never flinched. When he checked the rail and found it true, he said, "Good eye." It was only 2 words, but Mara carried them with her the rest of the day like something earned. The middle sister spent the afternoon mending one of Caleb's work shirts by the window, her stitches neat and tight. She glanced at him when she was done, waiting for his reaction. He held the shirt up, ran his thumb along the seam, and gave a single nod. She smiled small but proud. The youngest followed Caleb to the coop, scattering feed until the chickens clucked and flapped around her boots. Caleb crouched and showed her how to check for eggs without breaking them. She beamed when she found 3, carrying them back in her small hands as if they were treasure. When evening came, Mara stayed close by the fire while Caleb worked at the table, oiling the rifle. She watched him for a long while before saying, "Town won't come back?" "Not with the judge's word on it," he said. His tone was calm, but his eyes stayed on the rifle a moment longer than they needed to. "They hate losing," Mara said quietly. "They don't have to like it," Caleb replied. "Just have to leave you be." Something in her posture eased then, though she didn't look away. After supper, she stayed behind again to help wash the dishes. The room was quiet except for the scrape of tin against the basin and the soft hiss of the fire. When she passed him a plate, her fingers brushed his knuckles. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Caleb took the plate and set it aside. "You don't scare easy," he said, his voice low. "I can't afford to," Mara answered. He studied her a moment before nodding. "That's good." When the lean-to door closed behind her that night, Caleb sat by the fire longer than usual. The cabin no longer felt like a place for just one man. There were boots drying by the hearth, a half-mended blanket over the chair, and 3 breaths on the other side of the wall. It wasn't just a roof anymore. It was becoming a home, piece by piece. The calm that had settled over the ranch didn't last long. 2 weeks after the new pen was finished, Caleb spotted dust moving along the road from the corral. Not the slow, lazy kind of a passing traveler. This dust moved in a straight line, 3 riders abreast. His jaw tightened as he stood by the rail, wiping his hands on his shirt. He called toward the cabin, voice steady but firm. "Inside. Bar the door." Mara stepped onto the porch, caught sight of the riders, and her face went still. She didn't argue. She pulled the middle and youngest sister inside, dropped the bar across the door, and stood near the shuttered window. The youngest clutched her arm, whispering, "They're coming back?" Mara didn't answer, just put a hand over her sister's knuckles to still the shaking. By the time the riders reached the yard, Caleb was already standing in front of the porch, boots planted wide, rifle leaning against the wall behind him where he could reach it, but not in his hands. The lead rider was the same man who had jeered in the square weeks ago. His grin was meaner now, his hat pushed back, 2 friends flanking him on either side. "We came to settle this proper," the rider called. "Already settled," Caleb said, his voice level. "Paper don't mean much out here if no one's willing to back it," the man spat. Caleb didn't move. "Then back it," he said, stepping forward once, closing the space between them. "Here. Now." The words hung in the dry air. The other riders shifted in their saddles, waiting to see if it would turn ugly. Behind the shutter, Mara held her breath, one hand ready on the youngest shoulder, the other clutching the edge of the window frame, as if willing Caleb not to flinch. The lead rider's grin faltered just slightly when Caleb didn't break eye contact. "You think you can keep 3 you bought off a wagon? Ancient law says you marry or give him back." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Judge says they're free. They stay here because they chose to." One of the other riders let out a short, ugly laugh. "Women don't get to choose. Not out here." Caleb's hand twitched toward the rifle, but he didn't take it yet. "They do here," he said. For a moment, no one moved. Then the sound of hooves came from the road behind, the sheriff riding in with 2 men at his back. He reined up hard, dust rolling around him, a folded paper tucked in his belt. "Judge signed these," the sheriff said, loud enough for the yard to hear. "Any man try to claim these girls now does it against the court." The lead rider's eyes went from the sheriff to Caleb, weighing the risk. Finally, he spat in the dirt. "This ain't over," he muttered. "Yes, it is," Caleb said flatly. The man saw he meant it. He jerked the reins, turning his horse, and the other 2 followed. The sound of hooves faded until only the wind stirred the dust. Caleb didn't move until the sheriff dismounted and handed him the folded paper. "Keep this where you can show it," the sheriff said. Words bound to spread. Caleb nodded once. "Appreciate it." The sheriff tipped his hat toward the cabin, where Mara now stood in the doorway. She hadn't moved until she was sure the danger was gone. Her face was pale but steady. When the riders were only specks on the horizon, Caleb leaned the rifle back against the wall and let out a slow breath. Mara stepped down from the porch and stopped in front of him, close enough to touch. "You didn't fire," she said quietly. "Didn't have to," Caleb replied. Mara studied him for a moment, then reached out and put her hand over his, rough with calluses. It was a quick, firm squeeze, but it said more than any words. Then she let go before the sheriff saw too much, retreating inside where her sisters waited. That night, the house was quieter than usual. The youngest asked if the men would come back. Mara brushed her hair back from her face and said, "Not after today." She didn't know for certain, but she wanted her sister to sleep. Caleb sat by the fire longer than usual, the paper from the sheriff on the table beside him, its edges curling in the heat. Trouble had come to the door and turned back, and that mattered. When he finally banked the fire and went to bed, the cabin didn't feel quite so tense. It felt like it had passed some kind of test, like the ground under it had set a little firmer. The ranch felt different in the days after the riders left. The air no longer held the tight edge of waiting for hoofbeats, and the sisters moved through the cabin with an ease that hadn't been there before. The middle sister began humming while she worked, sometimes singing soft little scraps of songs remembered from before their father's debts, and the youngest laughed freely when the hens chased her boots. Even Caleb seemed to move differently, still quiet, still steady, but not with the same weight on his shoulders. He cleared out the small side room where he'd kept tools and feed, carrying the sacks to the shed until the space was empty. With plain boards and rails he'd cut himself, he built 2 narrow beds, sanding the corners smooth so they wouldn't catch a quilt. The middle sister watched him work, holding the lantern until her arms ached, and smiled when he stepped back to look at what he'd made. "Better than the floor," he said simply, and she nodded, already setting the blankets in place. Mara took over cooking that week. She stood at the stove with her sleeves rolled, turning bacon in the pan, while Caleb came in from the yard, shirt damp with sweat from mending fence. She glanced at him once, catching the way the scar on his shoulder showed pale against sunburned skin where the shirt clung. Her stomach twisted, not with fear this time, but with something else she wasn't ready to name. After supper, when the younger sisters had gone to their new beds, Mara stayed behind to wash the dishes. Caleb sat at the table, oiling the rifle, the fire casting light across the room. "You meant what you said," Mara said suddenly, her voice quiet but sure. "About what?" Caleb asked, not looking up. "About us choosing to stay. About this being our home." He set the rifle down and looked at her. "I meant it." Mara's eyes stayed on him a long moment. "Then I'm choosing," she said. Caleb stood, slow and deliberate, as if making sure neither of them would mistake what came next. He crossed the room until he was standing close enough that the heat from the stove and the fire mixed with the warmth between them. "You sure?" he asked. "I've been sure," Mara said, and there was no hesitation in her voice. Caleb's hand came up, brushing her cheek with the same care he'd use on a skittish colt. She didn't flinch. When he kissed her, it was slow, steady, the kind of kiss that built on every quiet look and every word they hadn't said since the day in the square. Mara stepped closer, her hands resting against his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart. When they finally drew apart, the room was silent except for the fire's low hiss. Mara didn't step back. Instead, she smiled faintly, the first unguarded smile Caleb had ever seen from her, and said, "I'm not afraid anymore." That night, after the house went quiet, she did not return to the lean-to. She stayed by the fire with Caleb, talking in low voices about what work needed doing before winter, about how much grain was left, about things that didn't matter except that they kept them sitting close until the fire burned down to embers. When he finally led her to his bed, it wasn't rushed or clumsy. It was steady, like the man himself. Clothes were shed carefully, as if neither wanted to break the spell. The house held its breath as they lay together for the first time, the glow from the coals washing the walls with soft light. Caleb touched her as though she might vanish, and Mara met every touch without fear. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood, rattling its last leaves, but inside the cabin there was warmth, the kind that stayed even after the fire went out. When dawn came, Mara rose with him, tying her hair back with a spare handkerchief. The middle sister saw her step from Caleb's room and said nothing, only smiled slightly and went back to her work. The youngest hummed as she scattered feed, as if she had known this was coming all along. The house felt settled now, not just a place to hide. It had the weight of a home, and for the first time since the wagon, the sisters no longer looked like they were ready to run. Caleb glanced at them as he stepped outside to hitch the mule, his face still quiet, but something about the way he shut the door said he knew they were his now, not because of money or paper, but because they had chosen to stay. The morning after the first frost, Caleb hitched the mule to the wagon while the sisters packed bread, coffee, and a jar of beans for the road. There was no talk of why they were going to town. Everyone knew. The paper from the judge had settled one part of the matter, but Caleb wanted more than words tucked under a floorboard. He wanted no one questioning what they were to him ever again. The ride-in was slow and steady. The middle sister sat tall on the wagon bench now, not glancing back over her shoulder the way she had weeks ago. The youngest pointed out things along the road. A hawk circling over the ridge, a coyote watching from a rise, her voice light, free of the tremor it once held. Mara sat beside Caleb, her shoulders square, her hair tied neatly with his handkerchief, her hand resting on the bench close enough to brush his. When they rolled into the square, the same faces turned to look. Some men smirked, some spat, but no one spoke. Caleb guided the mule straight to the clerk's office. The bell over the door gave a sharp ring as they stepped inside. The clerk didn't look surprised. "Figured you'd be back," he said, pulling out a set of papers from a drawer. Together, they walked to the judge's chamber, a small room lined with ledgers and a single window letting in pale morning light. The judge glanced at Caleb, then at Mara. "I take it this is what you want." Mara nodded once. "Yes." The judge filled in the license, his pen scratching across the page. He read the words aloud, then stood as witness while Caleb and Mara signed their names. The ring Caleb had bought in town the week before sat heavy in his pocket. He took it out and slid it onto Mara's finger, saying only 2 words, "my wife," as if speaking them aloud made them true in the world. Mara looked him in the eye and said, "My husband," steady and sure. When they stepped outside, the square felt different. The same men were there, but something in their faces had changed. A few nodded. One touched the brim of his hat. The sheriff stood near the porch rail and said, "That should put an end to it." And Caleb answered with a single nod. They bought coffee, salt, and a sack of seed before heading home. The wagon rolled out of town under clear sky, the sisters quiet but smiling, the youngest humming as she leaned against the middle one's shoulder. Back at the ranch, Caleb unhitched the mule and led it to water while Mara stood on the porch, her fingers touching the band on her hand as if making sure it was still there. The middle sister carried the supplies inside and began to put them away, moving with the easy rhythm of someone who belonged. The youngest ran to the coop to gather eggs, her laughter carrying across the yard. When Caleb came inside, Mara was waiting by the fire. She stepped close, rested her hand against his chest, and kissed him slow. It was not the careful kiss of the night before. It was steady, sure, the kind that left no question for anyone who might ask. That night the cabin was warmer than it had ever been. Mara lay beside Caleb with the fire throwing soft light across the walls, her hand still resting where the ring shone on her finger. In the next room, the middle sister slept soundly, the youngest curled under the quilt she had claimed as her own. The house no longer felt like a stop on the road or a place to hide from the world. It felt like it had roots, like something that would last. There were papers under the floor that said the law could not touch them, and there were boots by the door in 3 sizes, and a single pair under the bed for the woman who now bore his name. Caleb banked the fire, stretched out with Mara close against him, and listened to the quiet of the place. It was no longer the silence of an empty house, but the sound of a life beginning, steady and full. Tomorrow there would be fences to mend, grain to haul, and wood to split. Work never stopped on a ranch. But tonight, the work was done, and for the first time in years, Caleb closed his eyes with the sense that everything that mattered was inside these walls.